A new report by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition shows that people can no longer afford, on a minimum wage job, working full-time, no one can afford a one-bedroom apartment anywhere in the United States. Now, this is interesting. Now, this uses a standard measure of housing affordability, right, which standardizes all the different places. Now, a little caveat with that, right? It doesn't always, since you are taking a standard, you're taking it from everybody, which will skew the numbers a little bit. But regardless of that, the data is quite clear that most people cannot afford a one-bedroom apartment on a full-time minimum wage job. So let's dive into this. As I said, according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, you have a couple of charts here, and I'm going to get some data off these charts. All right. So according to the chart, hours needed at minimum wage to afford a one-bedroom house. Let's take Michigan, for example. In Michigan, you have to work at a minimum wage job an average of 58 hours a week. 58 hours. Okay. All right. What about California? Now, that's going to be super high. That's 92 hours a week. And by the way, the state's minimum wage in both Michigan and California are higher than the federal minimum wage. It's higher than 7.25. So let's talk about a state that is at the federal minimum wage, $7.25. Let's take Oklahoma, for example. Oklahoma, you need to work 59 hours a week just to be able to afford your rent at minimum wage, at the federal minimum wage. What about Texas? Great old, big old state of Texas, man. 73 hours. You need to work 73 hours in order to afford a one-bedroom apartment in the great state of Texas. But wait a minute, I thought that free market would sort everything out down in Texas. I thought that they were booming. I thought the economy was awesome in Texas. Well, how come it's incredibly expensive to be able to afford a one-bedroom unit in Texas? Wait a minute. Now, even in places where there is a minimum wage that's higher than the national average, people still don't work, people still don't make enough from working to be able to afford the housing wage. Now, let's take some numbers. I've got another chart here that kind of breaks this down. For Richmond, in Richmond, I believe the state minimum wage is about $9 an hour. A one-bedroom housing wage, however, if I'm reading this right, is about $9.60. Well, that can't be right. The local minimum wage, is $9.60, and the one-bedroom housing wage is $24.23, and a two-bedroom housing wage is $30.48. Now, we'll go to Oakland, California, right? Oakland. Now, the local minimum wage is $12.25 in Oakland. But in order to afford a one-bedroom house, you need to be making $24.23. And the list just goes on and on how housing is most likely in the 20s, unless you go, of course, to New Mexico, Bernalillo County, New Mexico. You need only about $13 an hour to afford a one-bedroom apartment or one-bedroom housing. In that same county, you'll need about $16.08 to afford a two-bedroom house. So in some places, like New Mexico, basically all in New Mexico, housing is just a little bit cheaper. So let's be fair on that. This is what this points out. So here you have people working full-time minimum wage jobs that cannot afford to get an apartment. Add on to that student loan debt, right? Which a lot of young people have. A lot of people across America carry these large student loan debt. And you wonder why the Bill O'Reillys of the world and conservative commentators are sitting here lamenting about, oh my God, these lazy millennials won't move out of their houses. Oh, they just want to, milk off mommy and daddy and not move out of their house. No, dude, they can't move out of their house because either they can't find a job, or they're too loaded with student debt to be able to afford a place on their own, or their minimum wage job, they can't afford even working full time to be able to afford an apartment on their own. And then they'll lament that young people aren't getting married. Well, how can you really meet someone if you're living at home with your parents because you can't afford an apartment, because you don't make enough, or you've got this giant student loan debt? These people are so disconnected to the problems of everyday average Americans. And then they wonder, what's their problem? Why don't they move away from home? Why are they complaining that they're poor? They own a microwave. They own a refrigerator. Even if they can afford an apartment, they're still poor because wages aren't high enough. And housing costs. Housing costs are a big part of this as well. It costs so much to get a place, to get a home. And we don't have enough funding available for rent-controlled, low-income housing, affordable apartments. Look, you go anywhere in the state. I live in Michigan. You go anywhere here, and you try to get a low-income apartment. You have to be on a waiting list, sometimes over a year, just to be able to get into a place. And there are stringent requirements, credit requirements, job requirements, income requirements that you have to meet. And if you don't meet those, you don't get an apartment. You don't get a place to live. And the minimum wage here is not very high in Michigan. We need a raise. We need to raise the wage. And we need to fund more affordable housing. We need to drive down the cost of housing. And we also need to drive down the costs of college. You're not giving people a good start. And you wonder why young people are complaining about having it so hard. Because we do have it hard. It's not like you could go to college and pay for it on a minimum wage job anymore. You can't do that. College is way more expensive than it used to be, and so is housing. These are problems that need to be solved. But in order to solve the problems, you have to admit that they exist.